How long can a newborn survive without milk? And how long can a man watch his child fade before something inside him finally breaks? That question hovered like frost in the winter air as the New Year bells of 1877 fell silent over Silver Creek, and Jack Sullivan, the one-eyed rancher everyone knew from a distance but few truly understood, held his son against his chest and felt the baby's breath weaken with every hour that passed. Snow blew sideways across the prairie, carried by a sharp wind that scraped bone. Lights from the town shimmered behind the haze like distant promises that never quite arrived. Inside the small cabin where Caroline had died only hours before, the silence had grown heavy, filled with everything Jack could no longer say to her. The bed still held her shape, her hair still rested on the pillow, but her eyes, once bright with stubborn joy, had closed for good. The child she left behind whimpered quietly, too weak now to cry, and that sound struck deeper than any wound Jack had ever taken, including the one that took his right eye. He wrapped the baby inside his coat, pulled his hat low over the empty space where an eye should have been, and walked into the night because there was nothing else left to do. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The cold bit through wool and leather. Every step carried the weight of memory. Caroline laughing in the sunlight, Caroline singing by the fire, Caroline whispering that everything would be all right. Now there was only wind, only darkness, and the slow, fading heartbeat against his chest. House by house, door by door. Jack knocked. He asked softly at first, then firmly, then desperately. Women looked at him with pity, with fear, with the tight-lipped judgment of people afraid of whispers and reputations, a widow nursing another man's child. In Silver Creek, that was a scandal carved in stone. Some closed the door gently. Some closed it hard. A few muttered that God would provide, but none reached for the child. As the hours dragged forward, Jack's voice lost strength. His hands shook, not from cold, but from terror. A rancher who had faced storms, stampedes, and violence, yet had never felt as powerless as he did holding this child who was slipping away. He tried the boarding house, the seamstress, the merchant's wife. He tried prayer, not because he still believed, but because there was nothing else left to try. And with every rejection, the town grew quieter, the windows darker, and the path ahead thinner. Midnight came. Fireworks popped faintly from the saloon, weak echoes of celebration in a year that felt cursed before it even began. Jack's breath fogged the air like smoke. His son moved less now, only a faint twitch beneath the coat. Panic rose in him like fire trapped beneath ice. Finally, his legs simply stopped. He reached the church steps, staggered once, and collapsed to his knees. Snow gathered on his hat brim. The baby whimpered, then fell silent. Silence was the most terrifying sound Jack had ever heard. He lowered his head and pressed his cheek to the tiny form, pleading without words, because the words had run out hours ago. He would have given his remaining eye, his land, his name, anything, if it meant hearing one strong cry. Instead, there was only stillness. Footsteps echoed somewhere behind him. A lantern's glow appeared, tentative but kind. Emily Carter, the postmaster's daughter, bent down, her breath shaking in the cold as she asked what happened. Jack didn't trust his voice anymore. He simply opened the coat enough for her to see the baby's pale face. Something shifted in her expression, urgency replacing shock. She told him, quickly, quietly, about a woman on the edge of town. Hannah Whitaker, a widow. A woman who had once held her own child, only to bury him in the frozen ground. Rumors said she still carried milk. Rumors also said plenty worse. Jack had learned long ago that people feared what they didn't understand. But in that moment, he didn't care about rumors. He cared about the faint, fading warmth in his arms. So he rose. Again, pain in his knees, fire in his chest, determination in his stride. He walked through blowing snow and darkened roads until he reached a small house lit by a single lamp in the window, its glow flickering against the storm. His hand hovered at the door. He hesitated, not from pride, but from fear of the answer. Then he knocked. The door opened slowly. Hannah stood there, candlelight softening the shadows beneath her tired eyes. She noticed the missing eye. She noticed the exhaustion. She noticed the child first. Without a word, she took the baby into her arms. Jack felt his world leave his hands. For a moment, terror clawed at his chest. Then relief crashed through him as the child finally latched, weakly at first, then with a strength that belonged to life refusing to surrender. Color crept back into the baby's cheeks. His tiny hands curled. His breath steadied. Jack let out a sound he didn't recognize. Part sob, part prayer, part stunned gratitude. Hannah looked up only once, and in that moment, pain recognized pain. No questions, no judgment, only choice. A choice to help, despite cost, despite talk, despite everything the town might say when daylight came. Outside, the New Year wind howled across the plains. Inside, a single fragile hope began, small as a breath, fierce as survival, delicate as love that hadn't yet discovered its name. Hannah did not need to ask who Jack Sullivan was. Silver Creek had already done that for her. She had heard the murmurs about the one-eyed rancher who kept to himself and made people uneasy. Yet in her doorway that New Year night, he didn't look like someone to fear or envy. He looked like a man whose world had already ended and who was still moving out of sheer stubbornness. The baby at her breast sucked weakly at first, then settled into a steadier rhythm. Each swallow anchored him a little more firmly to the living. Hannah's hands moved with the careful ease of a woman who had done this before. She did not let herself think of Thomas, the son she had carried and buried in the span of a single winter. She focused on this child and on the way his fists unclenched as warmth and milk reached him. "He needs heat," she said quietly. Her voice surprised Jack. It was softer than the rumors, but steadier too. "And you're not taking him back out in that storm." Jack glanced toward the rattling window. Snow pressed against the glass, turning the world into a shifting blur. "I don't mean to trouble you long," he managed, his voice raw from hours of pleading. "Just until he's stronger. I can pay, or work, whatever you think is right." Hannah studied him. She noticed the hollow under his cheekbones, the way his shoulders sagged now that the panic had eased, the instinctive angle he kept so that the empty right eye socket faced the shadow instead of the light. Loss had marked him in more ways than one. "You'll stay tonight," she said. "We'll talk about the rest in the morning." She nodded toward the table. "There's stew. Eat before you fall over." Jack's body answered before his pride could. He sank into the nearest chair. The stew was simple: potatoes, carrots, a bit of beef. But it tasted like something he hadn't felt since Caroline died. The sense that someone still believed in keeping another person alive. Hannah sat near the fire, shawl drawn close, the baby tucked against her. They ate mostly in silence. The fire cracked, the wind hammered at the walls, and the baby nursed. When Jack finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked toward the door. "I can sleep on the floor by the hearth," he said. "I won't trouble you more than I already have." Hannah followed his gaze to the storm outside. The road had already vanished beneath a deepening blanket of white. Sending him away would protect her reputation, but it might send a half-broken man into a night that finished the job. "You can stay," she said, "but we're clear on some things." Her eyes met his. "I don't need more trouble than I already have. If you're under my roof, you work. You show respect. You remember why you're here. The baby comes first." Jack nodded, almost too quickly. "Yes, ma'am." It felt like slipping into a familiar kind of order. Rules he understood. "Jack," he added a moment later, as if reminding himself he still had a name. "Jack Sullivan." "Hannah Whitaker," she replied. "You know it already, I expect." He hesitated. "People talk," he said. "About you, about me. They don't always know what they're talking about." One corner of her mouth twitched. "They say I'm strange, cold, cursed since my boy died. What they mean is grief makes them uncomfortable. They'd rather call it a problem than look it in the face. Her hand moved in slow circles along the baby's back. "Do you regret this?" he asked. "Helping us?" Hannah's eyes flicked up. "No," she said. "I regret plenty of things, not this." She shifted the baby and adjusted her shawl. "There's a blanket by the door. Make yourself a bed. We'll see what tomorrow looks like." As the hours stretched, the storm deepened. Wind shoved against the house, searching for seams. Jack lay near the hearth, boots off, coat rolled beneath his head. His one good eye watched the faint movement of Hannah's shadow on the wall as she rocked in the wooden chair. The baby nestled close. He thought of Caroline and how furious she would be if he let their child die because he was too proud to knock on a stranger's door. That thought eased something inside him. Maybe this was the only choice she would have forgiven. "Thank you," he said quietly into the dim room. He wasn't sure whether he meant Hannah, God, or his dead wife. Hannah heard him anyway. "You'll bring in wood tomorrow," she answered softly. "And water, and if you're staying longer than a day, we'll put some rules in place." It was the outline of a bargain. Jack's eyes finally closed, exhaustion dragging him down now that his son's breathing had turned deep and even. For the first time since the year began, he could imagine surviving to see another sunset. Hannah stayed awake a little longer. She watched the fire, then the man on her floor, then the baby whose tiny fingers had curled into the fabric of her dress as if claiming a right to be there. She thought of how the town lowered their voices when she walked by, of the way people crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. Let them talk, she decided. None of them had stood alone in a room with arms full of milk and no child to hold. This boy would not go into the ground if she could help it. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside Hannah Whitaker's small house, 3 lives settled into an uneasy alignment. Before the town had a chance to name what was happening, something stronger than fear had already taken root between them. A decision to choose compassion over safety, and to face whatever came next together, at least for one more night. By the time the thaw began to soften the edges of winter, the storm outside Hannah's house had quieted, but another kind had already begun to build in town. Silver Creek noticed everything. A one-eyed rancher coming and going from a widow's porch. A baby who now cried with strength instead of hunger. A lamp burning later than usual. Whispers traveled faster than wind across open prairie, and soon enough, the story stopped belonging to the people actually living it. Jack worked from dawn to dusk, chopping wood, patching fences, tending chores as if labor alone might repay what Hannah had given. He slept near the hearth or sometimes in the small spare room, never crossing lines that didn't belong to him. Hannah kept to her routines, caring for Matthew with the same steady patience she had shown that first night. There was an understanding between them, unspoken but solid, that this was about survival, not comfort, not longing, not anything that would complicate the fragile order they had built. But towns are rarely kind to arrangements that do not wear the right kind of name. At the mercantile, someone pretended not to see Jack. Outside the church, 2 women lowered their voices when Hannah passed, their glances sharp as broken glass. Haywood Clark, leaning lazy against a post, tipped his hat with a crooked grin and asked if Jack planned on starting a collection of widows. Jack didn't rise to it at first. He had Matthew to think about, but rumor makes itself louder when it goes unanswered. By early spring, Sheriff Thomas Baker, fair man, pragmatic, with a habit of seeing storms long before they broke, rode out to Hannah's house and tied his horse to the post. He stepped inside with the respectful caution of someone entering a space that wasn't quite sure of itself. "Afternoon," he said simply. Jack stopped stacking wood. Hannah paused at the table, Matthew in her arms. The sheriff looked from one to the other, then spoke without ornament. "You both know what folks are saying, and you both know how this town can be." He wasn't accusing. He was warning. The council's meeting. There's talk about decency laws, talk about forcing decisions. Jack's jaw tightened. "We're not doing anything wrong." "Maybe not," Baker replied. But if the town decides you are, that's the trouble anyway. Hannah's eyes lowered to the baby. What are they proposing? She asked. Baker exhaled slowly. Marriage or separation? Simple as that. The room went still. Not offended, not shocked, just quiet. Because somewhere inside, they had known this was coming. That night, after the sheriff left, they sat at the table long after the fire dimmed. The baby slept between them in a basket, soft breaths rising and falling. Jack spoke first. If I leave, he said, I don't know if he'll... He couldn't finish. Hannah watched the embers pulse orange and gold. If you stay without marrying, she said, they'll eat us alive. Neither looked at the other directly. The question hung between them like smoke. Marriage. A word weighted with history, implication, memory. Jack thought of Caroline, of vows spoken under a summer sky, of love that had grown like wildflowers along a riverbank. He could not replace that. He did not want to. Hannah thought of Daniel, her husband buried too early, and the little boy who had only borrowed life for a handful of days. She had built thick walls since then, the kind meant to keep good things out so losing them would hurt less. Marriage meant opening doors she wasn't sure she could walk through again, but Matthew slept, alive because of choices already made. And survival, once begun, asks to be continued. We could do it as arrangement, Hannah said finally. For the boy. You keep your room, I keep mine. We run the house together, that's all. Jack nodded slowly. It won't be romantic, he said, surprising himself with the honesty in his voice. No promises I can't make. I'm not asking for them, she replied. And so it was decided. Not as an act of love, not as surrender, but as a calculated defense against the sharpened tongues of Silver Creek. They were married in a small room at the courthouse, the justice of the peace reading words stripped bare of celebration. Caroline's name haunted the pauses. Daniel's ghost lingered at Hannah's shoulder. Sheriff Baker watched quietly, as witness, as protector, as man who knew the town needed fewer reasons to punish people simply trying to survive. There was no cake, no bouquet, just signatures. A ring Jack had worn once already, and a silence afterward that wasn't cold so much as uncertain. When they returned to Hannah's, now their house, nothing outwardly changed. Jack brought his few belongings inside. He moved their sleeping quarters apart more clearly to honor the promise they'd spoken without speaking. Matthew continued to thrive, his cries strong enough now to wake the dead. But a new tension threaded the walls. Duty had a way of settling into corners and turning air heavy. Jack worked harder than ever, as if effort could hold back grief. Hannah pressed her feelings into order. The meals cooked, the fire kept burning, the child bathed and fed. Yet at night, when everything quieted, the house felt like a fragile structure held together by fear of breaking it. Some neighbors softened once the marriage became official. Others simply sharpened their gossip into a different shape. Haywood Clark muttered about men who didn't know how to keep to themselves. Reverend Charles Alden, tall and rigid as a church steeple, called on them one afternoon and asked pointed questions about propriety wrapped in scripture. Hannah's patience lasted exactly as long as necessary. We're married, she said. The boy is safe. If you think God's displeased, you can take it up with him. Jack watched the exchange with a flicker of something like admiration. They were not lovers. Not yet. But they had begun to stand back to back against the world. Over time, the rhythm of shared life formed. Jack rising early to tend the yard. Hannah murmuring softly to Matthew in the gray light before dawn. Their words passing like quiet threads between them. Simple, necessary, restrained. And beneath it all lived the silent truth neither dared speak. Duty had replaced comfort and fear. Fear of loss, of misstep, of hope. Kept them both at arm's length from what might grow if either of them ever stepped closer. Out on the prairie, grass began to green. Calves were born. Winds softened. But inside that small house at the edge of Silver Creek, Winter still lingered in corners of the heart, waiting for the moment when something stronger than obligation might finally begin to thaw it. Spring in Silver Creek did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like someone unsure they were welcome, then lingered long enough that people finally began to trust it. Grass pushed through damp soil. River ice cracked and drifted away. The air softened, though the memories of winter still clung to the edges of things. Inside the small house at the edge of town, life continued with quiet rhythm. Wood stacked, bread baked, chores done, the child at the center of everything. From the outside, it looked simple. From the inside, it was anything but. Jack had become expert at standing one breath short of emotion. He moved through each day with measured steadiness, pouring effort into the land, into usefulness, into the certainty that working hands could keep grief at bay. Sometimes, when he lifted Matthew into his arms, he felt something fragile pull in his chest, like a thread that had been knotted too tightly and was trying to loosen. But he always stepped back before it could unravel. Hannah, in her own way, did the same. She poured herself into the baby, into the routines that kept the past from sneaking in. She couldn't look at Jack for too long without feeling the familiar ache, the fear that loving again meant losing again. So she kept her voice calm, her tone careful, her feelings folded away like fragile linens in a drawer that rarely opened. Yet life, stubborn and relentless, kept nudging them closer. One afternoon, Matthew fell ill. It began with a fever that rose too quickly and eyes that turned glassy with confusion. Panic, swift, unwelcome, merciless, surged through both of them. Jack sat beside the cradle through the night, wiping the child's forehead with trembling cloths, while Hannah whispered soft prayers she'd once sworn she no longer believed in. Breath after breath, they waited, fearing the worst because they had seen the worst before. When the fever finally broke just before dawn, relief hit Hannah so hard, she nearly collapsed. Jack caught her without thinking. For a moment, she leaned into him, her body shaking with release, with fear, with gratitude she could no longer contain. His arm tightened around her instinctively, steadying her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Something shifted then, the smallest movement, like ice cracking under sunlight. But the world beyond their walls did not rest. Haywood Clark, sour with resentment and resentment's close cousin, envy, had not forgotten his distaste for Jack. One evening he cornered Jack outside the saloon, anger already drunk into his voice. Harsh words followed. An insult thrown at Hannah's name sharpened everything. Jack did not start the fight, but he ended it, taking a blow, delivering another, both men hitting the dirt before Sheriff Baker pulled them apart. The next morning, Jack came home bruised and bleeding from his cheek. Hannah said nothing for a long time. Then she fetched a cloth and cleaned the wound with careful precision that carried more meaning than any lecture could have. "Don't let them drag you down to their darkness," she said softly. "We have enough shadows of our own." Jack watched her face, felt the warmth of her hand, and realized he was no longer afraid of wanting the life inside these walls. He was only afraid of losing it. Later that season, the town held its spring dance, the first since New Year. Word reached them, and Hannah almost chose to stay home, but Sheriff Baker stopped by and said quietly, "Sometimes you have to step into the light yourself, or the shadows win." So they went. The hall smelled of wood polish and lantern smoke. Music filled the room, sweet and unsure. Conversation stilled when they entered, but not as sharply as before. Some people nodded, others looked away. A few smiled. Jack stood beside Hannah, not touching, but near enough that anyone watching could see the line that now connected them. When Haywood Clark tried to stir trouble, he found himself cut short, not by fists this time, but by the quiet firmness of a town beginning to see that cruelty had worn out its welcome. Hannah felt it too, the shift, the softening. When she stepped outside later for air, her hands trembled. Jack joined her, and for the first time since their wedding, she let the truth slip free. She spoke of loss, of fear, of the way the past still reached through time to grip her heart. Her voice cracked. She hated that. But Jack didn't flinch. He didn't try to fix it, didn't offer false strength. He simply stayed. And in the staying, she felt something inside her begin to trust again. That night changed nothing and everything. They still slept in separate rooms. They still moved carefully. But silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like space where love might one day grow strong enough to speak its name. Small gestures gathered meaning. A mug of coffee placed wordlessly on a table. A hand brushing past another and lingering one heartbeat too long. A laugh breaking unexpectedly through grief. All of it delicate. All of it real. It wasn't dramatic passion. It wasn't sudden revelation. It was two wounded hearts slowly recognizing that they had begun, without ceremony or permission, to belong to each other. Then came the moment no one planned. One evening when a lantern slipped from Jack's fingers and shattered, and he cursed himself for the clumsiness of depth perception that had never fully returned since losing his eye. Hannah crossed the room and stopped him from kneeling into glass. "You don't have to be unbreakable," she whispered. He swallowed, because unbreakable had been the only armor he'd had left, and he realized it was crushing him. When he finally spoke, halting, quiet, he admitted he still loved Caroline, still felt the echo of her in every room. Hannah nodded, tears bright in her eyes, because she still loved what she had lost too. That honesty didn't divide them. It braided them together. Love was not a replacement. It was a companion to grief. By early summer, the walls they had built not to feel had begun to thin. They didn't rush what was forming. They didn't declare grand vows. They simply let love arrive the way spring had. Gradually, persistently, until one day they realized winter had at last retreated from the corners of the house. By the time summer had settled fully over Silver Creek, the town had grown used to the quiet routine of the Sullivan household, even if some people pretended otherwise. Habit has a way of dulling sharp judgment, and what once seemed scandalous slowly became ordinary. Jack's steady presence in town, Hannah's calm dignity, the baby perched on one hip while she spoke softly with the few neighbors who dared to offer kindness. It wasn't love that changed public opinion. It was the stubborn normalcy of a family choosing to exist, day after day, despite the whispers. And eventually people tired of whispering. Jack sold the distant ranch. The land where he and Caroline had once planned a future no longer felt like home. It felt like a ghost holding him in place. With the money, he purchased a smaller piece of land closer to town, manageable, modest, enough to sustain them without isolating them. When he told Hannah the news, he half expected pushback. Instead, she simply nodded, as if acknowledging a truth that had already been forming between them. They were building a life together, whether either of them had meant to or not. Matthew grew strong and lively, a child born from tragedy and raised in quiet resilience. He toddled through the grass with unsteady joy, chasing sunlight and laughter as if grief had never touched him. Jack often watched him with a complicated ache, pride and fear, gratitude and sorrow, the understanding that life could be both cruel and generous in the same breath. Hannah watched them both with a tenderness she no longer tried to hide. Her heart had become a place where two men, one lost, one living, could coexist without conflict. When the first autumn wind arrived, Hannah realized she was late. Weeks late. She said nothing at first, wanting to be sure, wanting to hold the fragile possibility in her hands before exposing it to the world. When she finally told Jack, her voice trembled, not with regret, but with wonder, and a thread of fear so thin it nearly vanished beneath hope. Jack stilled. The weight of the words rippled through him. Another child, another chance, another risk. For one long moment, he didn't speak. Then he stepped forward, simply placing his hand over hers. That small gesture held acceptance, joy, and the quiet vow that whatever came, they would face it together. Not as strangers, not as survivors bound only by duty, but as partners. The town noticed the change before either of them spoke of it aloud. People nodded to them in the street. Some even smiled. Reverend Alden stopped by one afternoon and, with more humility than he had shown in months, admitted that perhaps he had judged too harshly. Hannah did not gloat. Jack did not boast. They simply received the apology like a fresh breath of air, letting it ease a pressure they had grown accustomed to carrying. As the leaves began to fall, love finally stepped into the open between them, not with sudden fireworks, but with a quiet confession spoken in the safety of night. Hannah told Jack she loved him, voice breaking on the words. He told her he loved her too, not instead of Caroline, but alongside her memory. Hannah understood. Love could exist without erasing the past. It could honor what had been while nurturing what still might be. That truth did not weaken them. It anchored them. The following spring, Hannah gave birth to a healthy baby girl. The midwife, Lucy Henderson, now gentler and wiser than before, held the child with reverent care. Jack kissed Hannah's forehead, overwhelmed by gratitude and fear and joy, all tangled together. He thought of the winter night when everything had nearly ended. He thought of the moment Hannah opened her door, and he understood that his life had been rewritten not through dramatic miracles, but through compassion, persistence, and the courage to keep choosing one another. Years would pass. Some hardships would remain. But Silver Creek would come to see the Sullivan family not as scandal, nor as tragedy, but as a testament to what love could salvage from ruin. And Jack and Hannah would come to understand that family is not awarded by blood alone. It is built slowly and deliberately, through hands that refuse to let go. Even when the world says they should, they were no longer surviving, they were simply living. When time had softened the sharp edges of memory, their story no longer sounded like tragedy. It became something quieter, steadier, almost like a lullaby the town hummed without knowing. A one-eyed rancher who had nearly lost everything, a widow who had already buried too much, a child who began life on the edge of silence. They met in winter when the world felt cold and fragile, and somehow, despite fear and rumor and grief, they chose kindness. Then they chose duty. And slowly, gently, they chose love. Not loud love, not perfect love, just real love, the kind that makes room for sorrow without letting sorrow take the last word. The town changed. They changed. A new baby cried into the world, healthy and whole. And the house at the edge of Silver Creek, once shadowed by doubt, grew warm with laughter. If someone were to stand outside at dusk, they might hear voices drifting from the open window, soft, steady, full of ordinary hope. And they might understand that healing does not erase what came before. It simply teaches the heart to beat again, one day at a time. And that was enough. End of article. Good night.